Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we turn great works of English literature into gripping radio shows. I'm your host, Joshua Cornwell, and tonight we're presenting Part 4 in our 5-part adaptation of The Red-Headed League, a classic Sherlock Holmes story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. In this episode, Holmes and Watson investigate the bizarre story of Mr. Wilson, a man who was briefly employed by a mysterious league established to benefit red-headed people. The office of the league was suddenly and mysteriously closed, and Holmes believes it may have been cover for some more sinister purpose. Having investigated the neighborhood where Mr. Wilson works as a pawnbroker, Holmes and Watson are preparing for their next move. Holmes and I exited the concert hall where we had been enjoying the violin playing of Sarasate. My friend had an ecstatic expression on his face, and I knew that we were on the brink of some big move in his investigation of the case.
You want to go home, no doubt, Doctor?
Yes, it would be as well.
And I have some business to do which will take some hours. This business at Coburg Square is serious.
Why serious?
A major crime is being prepared. I have every reason to believe that we shall be in time to stop it. But today being Saturday complicates matters. I shall need your help tonight.
At what time?
10 will be early enough.
I shall be at Baker Street at 10.
Very well. And I say, Doctor, there may be some little danger, so kindly put your army revolver in your pocket.
He waved his hand, turned on his heel, and disappeared in an instant among the crowd. I trust that I am no more dense than my neighbors, but I am always oppressed by a sense of my own stupidity in my dealings with Sherlock Holmes. I had heard what he had heard, seen what he had seen, and yet from his words it was evident he saw clearly not only what had happened, but what was about to happen, while to me the whole business was confused and grotesque. As I returned to my house in Kensington, I thought over everything we'd learned, from the extraordinary story of the Red-Headed League down to our visit to Saxe-Coburg Square. I thought of Holmes's ominous final words to me. What was this nighttime expedition, and why should I go armed? Where were we going, and what would we do? I had a hint from Holmes that this smooth-faced pawnbroker's assistant Spaulding was a formidable man, a man who might play a deep game. I tried to think it out, but gave it up in despair and set the matter aside until the night would bring an explanation. It was 9:15 when I left home and made my way across the park and through Oxford Street to Baker Street. 2 cabs were standing by the door, and as I entered the passage, I heard the sound of voices from above. When I entered the apartment, I found Holmes in animated conversation with 2 men, one of whom I recognized as Peter Jones, an official police officer. The other was a long, thin, sad-faced man with a very shiny hat and respectable frock coat. Holmes greeted me with a smile as he threw on his coat and hat.
Ha! Our party is complete, Watson. I think you know Mr. Jones of Scotland Yard. Let me introduce you to Mr. Merriweather, who will be our companion in tonight's adventure.
We're hunting in couples again, Doctor. Our friend Holmes here is a wonderful man for starting a chase. All he needs is an old dog like me to help running down his prey.
I hope a wild goose will not be the end of our chase.
You may place considerable confidence in Mr. Holmes, sir. His methods are, if you don't mind my saying so, just a little too theoretical and fantastic, but he has the makings of a detective in him. It is not too much to say that once or twice he has been more nearly correct than the official force.
Oh, if you say so, Mr. Jones. Still, I miss my game of bridge. It is the first Saturday night in 27 years that I have not played my game of bridge.
I think you will find you're playing for higher stakes tonight than you have ever done before in your life. For you, Mr. Merriweather, the stakes will be some £30,000, and for you, Jones, it will be a man you've been dying to lay your hands on.
John Clay, murderer, thief, smasher, and forger. He's a young man, Mr. Merriweather, but he is at the head of his profession, and I would rather have my handcuffs on him than on any criminal in London. He's a remarkable man, John Clay. His grandfather was a royal duke, and he himself went to Eton and Oxford. His brain is as cunning as his fingers. He'll crack a safe in Scotland one week and be raising money to build an orphanage in Cornwall the next. I've been on his track for years and have never even set eyes on him.
I hope that I may have the pleasure of introducing you tonight. I've had one or two little run-ins with Mr. John Clay, and I agree he is at the head of his profession. But it is past 10 and the time we started. If you two gentlemen will take the first cab, Watson and I will follow in a second.
Sherlock Holmes was not very talkative during the long drive and sat back in the cab humming to himself. We rattled through an endless maze of gas-lit streets until we arrived in Farringdon Street.
We're close now. This Merryweather is a bank director and personally interested in this business. I thought it best to have Jones with us as well. He's not a bad fellow, but an absolute imbecile in his profession. He has only one positive virtue. He is as brave as a bulldog and as tenacious as a lobster. Here we are, and they are waiting for us.
We had reached the same busy street we had found ourselves in earlier that morning. Following the guidance of Mr. Merryweather, we walked down a narrow alley and through a side door, which he unlocked for us. Inside was a small corridor ending in a massive iron gate. This also was opened, and we walked down a flight of winding stone steps, which ended at another heavy gate. Mr. Merryweather stopped here to light a lantern, and then led us down into a dark, earth-smelling passage. Finally, after opening a third door, we found ourselves in a huge vault or cellar, piled all round with crates and massive boxes. Holmes held up his lantern and looked around.
You're not very vulnerable from above.
Nor from below.
Merryweather banged his stick on the stones on which he stood.
Be quiet! You just endangered our whole operation. I beg that you would have the good sense to sit down at one of those boxes and not interfere.
Mr. Merryweather solemnly perched himself on a crate with an injured expression on his face, while Holmes fell to his knees on the floor and began to examine the cracks between the stones. A few seconds satisfied him, and he sprang up to his feet again.
We have at least an hour before us. They can hardly take any steps until the good Mr. Wilson is safely in bed. Then they will not lose a moment, for the sooner they do their work, the longer they will have to escape. We are now, Doctor, in the cellar of the city branch of one of the major London banks. Mr. Merryweather is the chairman of directors, and he will explain to you the reason why the most daring criminals of London have taken a considerable interest in this cellar tonight.
It is the French gold.
French gold?
Yes, several months ago, the bank borrowed 30,000 Napoleons from the Bank of France. They have never had cause to unpack the money, and it is still lying in this cellar. The crate upon which Mr. Merryweather sits contains 2,000 Napoleons packed in layers of lead foil.
This gold reserve is much larger than what's usually kept in a single branch. The directors have been worrying about it.
Such worries were well justified. It is now time that we arranged our little plans. I expect that within an hour matters will come to a climax. In the meantime, Mr. Merryweather, we must put out that lantern.
And sit in the dark?
I'm afraid so. I brought a pack of cards in my pocket. I thought that, as we were a party of four, you might have your game of bridge after all. But I see that the enemy's preparations have gotten so far that we can't risk the presence of light, and now we must choose our positions. These are daring, dangerous men, and though we have them at a disadvantage, they could do us some harm unless we are very careful. I shall stand behind this crate, and you conceal yourselves behind those. When I flash the light, jump them. If they fire, Watson, have no hesitation to gun them down.
I placed my revolver, cocked, on the wooden case behind which I crouched. Holmes closed the cover on the front of the lantern and left us in pitch darkness, in absolute darkness I have never before experienced. The smell of hot metal assured us that the light was still there, ready to flash out at a moment's notice. To me, with my nerves worked up to a pitch of expectancy, there was something anxious and depressing in the sudden dark and cold air of the vault.
They have only one way out. That is back through the house of Mr. Wilson to Saxe-Coburn Square. I hope that you have done what I asked you, Jones?
I have an inspector and 2 officers waiting at the front door of the house.
Then we've plugged all the holes. Now we must be silent and wait.
And with that, we've come to the end of the second-to-last episode in our adaptation of The Red-Headed League. Holmes has gathered his forces and laid a trap in the vaults of a London city bank just opposite the home of his client, Mr. Wilson. What will the results of this trap be, and how do these goings-on at the bank connect to Mr. Wilson and his bizarre story of the Red-Headed League which once employed him? Find out tomorrow night in our final episode of the Red-Headed League here on BeFM Drama.